One of the most fascinating and enigmatic, if not the most successful, singer-songwriters of the late 60s, Leonard Cohen retained an audience across 6 decades of music-making interrupted by various digressions into personal and creative exploration, all of which have only added to the mystique surrounding him. Second only to Bob Dylan, he commanded the attention of critics and younger musicians more firmly than any other musical figure from the 60s who continued to work into the 21st century, which is all more remarkable an achievement for someone who didn't even aspire to a musical career until he was in his 30s. Cohen was born in 1934, a year before Elvis Presley, and his background, personal, social, and intellectual, couldn't have been more different from those of the rock or folk stars of any generation. Though he knew some country music and played it a bit as a boy, he didn't start playing on even a semi-regular basis, much less recording, until after he'd already written several books. And as an established novelist and poet, his literary accomplishments far exceeded those of Bob Dylan or most anyone else who one cares to mention in music. He was born Leonard Norman Cohen into a middle-class Jewish family in the Montreal suburb of Westmount. His father, a clothing merchant, died in 1943 when Cohen was just 9 years old. It was his mother who encouraged Cohen as a writer, especially of poetry, during his childhood. This fit in with the progressive intellectual environment in which he was raised, which allowed him free inquiry into vast range of pursuits. His relationship to music was more tentative. He took up the guitar at age 13 initially as a way to impress a girl, but was good enough to play country and western songs at local cafes, and he subsequently formed a group called the Buckskin Boys. At 17, he enrolled in McGill University as an English major. By this time, he was writing poetry in earnest and became part of the university's tiny underground bohemian community. Cohen only earned average grades, but was good enough as a writer to earn the McNaughton Prize in creative writing by the time he graduated in 1955. A year later, the ink barely dry on his degree, he published his first book of poetry, Let Us Compare Mythologies, in 1956, which got great reviews, but didn't sell especially well. He was already beyond the age that rock and roll was aimed at. Bob Dylan, by contrast, was still Robert Zimmerman, still in his teens, and young enough to become a devotee of Buddy Holly when the latter emerged. In 1961, Cohen published his second book of poetry, The Spice Box of Earth, which became an international success critically and commercially, and established Cohen as a major new literary figure. Meanwhile, he tried to join the family business and spent some time at Columbia University in New York writing all the time. Between the modest royalties from sales of his second book, literary grants from the Canadian government, and a family legacy, he was able to live comfortably and travel around the world, partaking of much of what it had to offer, including some use of LSD when it was still legal, and ultimately selling for an extended period in Greece, on the Isle of Hydra in the Aegean Sea. He continued to publish, issuing a pair of novels, The Favorite Game in '63 and Beautiful Losers in '66, with a pair of poetry collections, Flowers for Hitler in '64 and Parasites of Heaven in '66. The Favorite Game was a very personal work about his early life in Montreal, but it was Beautiful Losers that proved another breakthrough, earning the kind of reviews that authors dare not even hope for. Cohen found himself compared to James Joyce in the pages of the Boston Globe, and across the years, the book has enjoyed sales totaling well into 6 figures. It was around this time that he also started writing music again, songs being a natural extension of his poetry. His relative isolation on Hydra, coupled with his highly mobile lifestyle when he left the island, his own natural iconoclastic nature, and the fact that he avoided being overwhelmed or even touched too seriously by the currents running through popular music since the 40s, combined to give Cohen a unique voice as a composer. Though he did settle in Nashville for a short time in the mid-60s, he didn't write quite like anyone else in country music mecca or anywhere else. This might have been an impediment, but for the intervention of Judy Collins, a folk singer who had just moved to the front rank of that field. Collins had a voice just special enough to move her beyond the relatively emaciated ranks of remaining popular folk performers after Dylan shifted to electric music. She was still getting heard, and not just by the purists left behind in Dylan's wake. She added Cohen's Suzanne to her repertoire and put it on her album In My Life, a record that was controversial enough in folk circles because of her cover of the Beatles song that gave the LP its title, to pull in a lot of listeners and get wide airing. The LP's Suzanne received a considerable amount of airplay, and Cohen was also represented on the album by Dress Rehearsal Rag. It was Collins who persuaded Cohen to return to performing for the first time since his teens. He made his debut during the summer of '67 at the Newport Folk Festival, followed by a pair of sold-out concerts in New York City and an appearance singing his songs and reciting his poems on the CBS network television show Camera 3, and his show entitled Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Leonard Cohen. It was around the same time that actor-singer Noel Harrison brought Suzanne onto the pop charts with a recording of his own. One of those who saw Cohen perform at Newport was John Hammond Sr., the legendary producer whose career went back to the 30s with the likes of Billie Holiday, Benny Goodman, and Count Basie, and extended up through Bob Dylan and ultimately to Bruce Springsteen. Hammond got Cohen signed to Columbia Records, and he created the Songs of Leonard Cohen, which was released just before Christmas of '67. Producer John Simon was able to find a restrained yet appealing approach to recording Cohen's voice, which might have been described as an appealingly sensitive near monotone, yet that voice was perfectly suited to the material at hand, all of which, written in a very personal language, seemed drenched in downbeat images as a spirit of discovery as a path to unsettling revelation. Despite its spare production and melancholy subject matter, or very possibly because of it, the album was an immediate hit by the standards of folk music world and the budding singer-songwriter community. In an era in which millions of listeners hung on next albums of Bob Dylan and Simon & Garfunkel, whose own latest album had ended with a minor key rendition of Silent Night set against radio news account of the death of Lenny Bruce, Cohen's music quickly found a small but dedicated following. College students by the thousands bought it. In its second year of release, the record sold over 100,000 copies. The Songs of Leonard Cohen was as close as Cohen ever got to mass audience success. Amid all of this sudden musical activity, he hardly neglected his other writing. In 1968, he released a new volume, Selected Poems, 1956 through 1968, which included both old and newly published work, and earned him the Governor General's Award, Canada's highest literary honor, which he proceeded to decline. By this time, he was actually almost more a part of the rock scene, residing for a time in New York's Chelsea Hotel, where his neighbors included Janis Joplin and other performing luminaries, some of whom influenced his songs very directly. His next album, Songs from a Room, in 1969, was characterized by an even greater spirit of melancholy. Even the relatively spirited A Bunch of Lonesome Heroes was steeped in such depressing sensibilities, and the one song not written by Cohen the Partisan was a grim narrative about the reasons for and consequences of resistance to tyranny that included lines like "She died without a whisper" and included images of wind blowing past graves. Joan Baez subsequently recorded the song, and in her hands it was a bit more upbeat and inspiring to the listener. Cohen's rendition made it much more difficult to get past the costs presented by the singer's persona. And on the other hand, Seems So Long Ago, Nancy, although as downbeat as anything else here, it did present Cohen in his most expressive and commercial voice, a nasal but affecting and finely nuanced performance. In all, however, Songs from a Room was less well received commercially and critically. Bob Johnston's restrained, almost minimalist production made it less overtly appealing than the subtly commercial trappings of his debut, though the album did have a pair of tracks, Bird on the Wire and The Story of Isaac, that became standards rivaling Suzanne. The Story of Isaac, a musical parable woven around biblical imagery about Vietnam, was one of the most savage and piercing songs to come out of the anti-war movement, and showed a level of sophistication in its music and lyrics that put it in a whole separate realm of composition. It received an even better airing on the Live Songs album in a performance recorded in Berlin during 1972. Cohen may not have been widely popular a performer or recording artist, but his unique voice and sound and the power of his writing and its influence helped him gain entry into the front rank of rock performers, an odd status for the then 35-year-old author-composer. He appeared at the 1970 Isle of Wight Festival in England, a post-Woodstock gathering of stars and superstars, including late appearances by such soon-to-die or disband legends as Jimi Hendrix and The Doors. Looking nearly as awkward as his fellow Canadian Joni Mitchell, Cohen strummed his acoustic guitar backed by a pair of female singers in front of an audience of 600,000, comprising equal portions of fans, freaks, and belligerent gatecrashers, but the mere fact that he was there, sandwiched somewhere between Miles Davis and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, was a clear statement of the status he'd achieved. Cohen's performance of Suzanne was one of the highlights of the Murray Lerner's long-delayed 1996 documentary Message to Love. The Isle of Wight Festival, and his full set was reissued in 2009, both on audio and video formats. Already, he had carved out a unique place for himself in music, as much author as performer and recording artist, letting his songs develop and evolve across years. His distinctly non-commercial voice became part of his appeal to the audience he found, giving him a unique corner of his music audience comprising listeners descended from the same people who had embraced Bob Dylan's early work before he'd become a mass media phenomenon in 1964. In a sense, Cohen embodied a phenomenon vaguely similar to what Dylan enjoyed before his early 70s tour with the band. People bought his albums by the tens and occasionally hundreds of thousands, but seemed to hear him in uniquely personal terms. He earned his audience seemingly one listener at a time, by word of mouth more than by radio, which in any case was mostly friendly to covers of Cohen songs by other artists. Cohen's third album, Songs of Love and Hate, in 1971, was one of his most powerful works, brimming with piercing lyrics and music as poignantly affecting as it was in his minimalist's approach. Arranger Buckmaster's work on strings was oddly muted, and the children's chorus that showed up on last year's Man was spare in its presence. Balancing them was Cohen's most effective vocalizing to date, brilliantly expressive around such acclaimed songs as Joan of Arc, Dress Rehearsal Rag, which had been recorded by Judy Collins 5 years before, and Famous Blue Raincoat. The bleakness of the tone and subject matter ensured that he would never become a pop performer. Even the beat-driven Diamonds in the Mine, catchy's children chorus accompaniment and all, with a twangy electric guitar accompaniment to boot, was as dark as venomous a song as Columbia Records put out in 1971. And the most compelling moments, among an embarrassment of riches, came on lyrics like, "Now the flames, they followed Joan of Arc as she came through the dark, no moon to keep her armor bright, no man to get her through the night." Songs of Love and Hate, coupled with the earlier hit versions of Suzanne, etc., earned Cohen a large international cult following. He also found himself in demand in the world of commercial filmmaking, as director Robert Altman used his music in his 71 feature film Macabre and Mrs. Miller, starring Warren Beatty and Julie Christie, a revisionist period film set at the turn of the 19th century that was savaged by the critics and, some by accounts, sabotaged by its own studio, but went on to become one of the director's best-loved movies. The following year, he also published a new poetry collection, The Energy of Slaves. As was his wont, Cohen spent years between albums, and in 1973 he seemed to take stock of himself as a performer by issuing Leonard Cohen, Live Songs. Not a conventional live album, it was a compendium of performances from various venues across several years and focused on highlights of his output from '69 onward. It showcased his writing as much as his performing, but also gave a good account of his appeal to his most serious fans, those still uncertain of where they stood in relation to his music, who could get past the epic length "Please Don't Pass Me By," knew for certain they were ready to join the inner circle of his legion of devotees after that, while others who only appreciated Bird on the Wire or The Story of Isaac could stay comfortably in an outer ring. But meanwhile, in 1973, Leonard's music became the basis for a theatrical production called Sisters of Mercy, conceived by Gene Lesser and loosely based on Cohen's life, or at least a fantasy version of his life. A 3-year lag ensued between Songs of Love and Hate and Cohen's next album, and most critics and fans just assumed that he'd hit a dry spell, with the live album covering the gap. He was busy performing, however, in the United States and Europe in '71 and '72, and extended his appearances into Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. It was during this period that he also began working with pianist and arranger John Lesar, who he engaged as producer on his next album, New Skin for the Old Ceremony, in 1974. That album seemed to justify his fans' continued faith in his work, presenting Cohen in a more lavish musical environment. He proved capable of holding his own in a pop environment, even if the songs were mostly still depressing and bleak. The following year, Columbia Records released The Best of Leonard Cohen, featuring a dozen of his best-known songs, principally hits in the hands of other performers from his previous 4 LPs, though it left out Dress Rehearsal Rag. It was also during the mid-'70s that Cohen first crossed paths professionally with Jennifer Warnes, appearing on the same bill with the singer at numerous shows, which would lead to a series of key collaborations in the ensuing decade. By this time, he was somewhat less mysterious persona, having toured extensively and gotten considerable exposure among many other attributes. Cohen became known for his uncanny attractiveness to women, which seemed to go hand in glove with the romantic subjects of most of his songs. In 1977, Cohen reappeared with the ironically titled Death of a Ladies' Man, the most controversial album of his career, produced by Phil Spector. The notion of pairing Spector, known variously as a Svengali-like presence to his female singer and artists, and most unrepentant and often justified overproducer in the field of pop music, with Cohen must have seemed like a good one to someone at some point, but apparently Cohen himself had misgivings about many of the resulting tracks that Spector never addressed, having mixed the record completely on his own. The resulting LP suffered from the worst attributes of Cohen and Spector's work, overly dense and self-consciously imposing in its sound, and virtually bathing the listener in Cohen's depressive persona, but showing his limited vocal abilities to disadvantage, owing to Spector's use of scratch vocals and his unwillingness to permit the artist to redo some of his weaker moments on those takes. For the first and only time in Cohen's career, his near-monotone delivery of this period wasn't a positive attribute. Cohen's unhappiness with the album was widely known among fans, who mostly bought it with that caveat in mind, so it didn't harm his reputation. A year after its release, Cohen also published a new literary collection using the slightly different title, Death of a Ladies' Man. So Cohen's next album, Recent Songs, in 1979, returned him to the spare settings of his early 70s work and showed his singing to some of its best advantage. Working with veteran producer Henry Louis, best known for his work with Joni Mitchell, the album showed Cohen's singing as attractive and expressive in its quiet way, and songs such as The Guests seeming downright pretty. He still wrote about life and love, and especially relationships, in stark terms, but he seemed to be moving into a pop mode on numbers such as Humbled in Love. Frank Sinatra never needed to look over his shoulder at Cohen, at least as a singer, but he did seem to be trying for a slicker pop sound at moments on his record.
Oh.